Okay, so hello everyone. Very happy to be here and another masterclass from Metapilot Academy. I'm Diana, um, and this is Scott Schneider. He has a very strong background in law and everything related to aerospace and space. And we've been thinking about organizing a masterclass around regulations and how to innovate under regulation. And this is going to be relevant for every aspect of every industry. But as you all know, aerospace is a highly, sorry, um, aerospace and space are highly regulated industries. That's why the training is important. So Scott is going to tell you more about that and also how to take massive steps when it comes to technological innovation, especially in the field of a lot of legacy systems, from IT to cybersecurity to compliance and all of that. Scott, I prefer actually if you introduce yourself just to make sure that you cover everything. And thank you so much in advance. Thank you for your time. I'll be around and we can take it from here. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Diana. If you can't hear me or if I drop out, let me know. I'm going to share my screen, and then about one or two slides in is when I'll do my introduction. So let's just see if this will work. Mm-hmm. Okay, what I'll have to do is share my entire monitor, but I can do that. Okay. Well, while I'm doing this, it says I need to fix a setting on my browser. So I'm going to do that. And I'm just going to introduce myself while I'm doing that. My name is Scott Schneider. I'm very happy to contribute to this session for you all and with Diana, because it's a wonderful program, partly because it's interdisciplinary and also because I've been listening to some of the other sessions here, and I can realize how at the same time as being both broad as well as being in-depth, the topics are going, and I'm hoping to be able to complement some of that from my background, which is, it is in regulation and in legal compliance, but it's coming from an economic perspective, having worked in industry and applying some essential principles of economics that quite often go missed when governments are regulating a certain activity or when they are developing strategy for a certain area of innovation. And so some of the insights I hope will be useful to you as you pursue your projects and greater careers. But I still haven't found out how to share my screen here. So please just give me 30 seconds as I read through this.
Hey Scott, how's it going? I should check on our end if it's allowing you to share. Let me check very quickly. But yeah, thank you for the introduction. I think the legal part is really interesting. And one thing we realized at the Academy is that, there are a lot of things that are connected, from compliance to cybersecurity to, for example, engineering going into regulation. For example, it's important to know what kind of aircraft you're building and what regulation it will fall under. For example, the famous Regent example with the boat that is a hovering boat, but because it remains under a certain altitude, it doesn't fall under flying car regulations, which means it has a much faster approval rate. So this is just a starting point into the topic, but also, the kind of careers that people can have in this field.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. And even if you're a technical, your field is in the technical domain, as if you're an engineer or data scientist, the projects that you'll be working on will inevitably be affected by policy and regulation. So
mm,
being aware of this is also um, a good way to just add value to your teams when you're working on them. Okay, now I've just
for
tried a
sure.
new browser here because I think there's
Hmm.
an issue with the browser on this particular computer.
Yeah, just let me know where you are. No worries. Do you see the share screen icon? Is it allowing you to do that?
Here, I'm going to move on.
I think you might be muted. If you like, there's also the option that you send me your slides and I can add them here. Maybe there's something I'm missing. Let me check. Ah, guest can control all presentations. Try now. I think I might have blocked you until now to share. You can try sharing again. So yeah, Scott, I think you might be still muted, at least for me. Yep, you're still muted. Ah, you share the screen. Yoo-hoo, it's working.
So you can hear me okay and see my
Yes.
screen now?
Not yet. Ah, okay, I have to add you to the scene. I see. How do I do that? Let's see. So we got a notification that you are sharing, and I have to add it. But the notification disappeared. So there's that. Screen sharing. Yeah, can I please ask you to share your there we go. Screen sharing is not allowed. How odd. Could I please ask you to share your screen again or send your presentation to me? In the meantime, some background about Scott. Um, so Scott is doing special counsel at International Aerospace Law and Policy Group. Um, he has an LLM in air and space law, so he's doing a lot of advisory work around aerospace and space law practice, which is an emerging field, but it's also a very interesting field to specialize in. He also has, among others, a background from International Space University that we know well, and has focused on the space study program, so management, space systems, finance, law, and physics. And his focus has been on small satellites, recommendation for the global south, and then a very, very strong background in Bachelor of Law from Victoria University, Bachelor of Business, as well as Management, Economics, German language, Spanish language, International Business, and Cultural Studies. So this would be an entire module in the Metapilot Academy, which is combining law compliance, cybersecurity, and all of these things in one. And interestingly, this module actually branches out into everything because things that are in the future mobility field have an overlap between aerospace and mobility because they are flying cars technically. So they are both in the air and on the ground. We were talking about hovering boats earlier. So the air, land, and sea combination. So all of these things are connected, and it makes sense to even understand um, the boundaries between air and space and sea and how regulation works in each of them, and also to think of new vehicles that might be transcending all of these. Oh, sorry, I'm
How's
calling
that?
Scott
Can you see me and
again.
hear me now?
Yes, perfectly. So try to
Okay.
add a source and share your screen now. It might be that we blocked you. No rush. I was just talking about your background, which is quite extensive. Are there any volunteering experiences that we should know about?
Volunteering, you mean from projects that I'm involved in?
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, I mean, so I'm involved in a couple of different endeavors. One of them is working for a law firm that does aerospace, called the International Aerospace Law and Policy Group. We're very
Mm-hmm.
open to volunteering or doing specific project and research related work. For the legal casework is a bit difficult because it requires a bit more issues with privacy and data management, but we're always open to expressions of interests. So I can leave the details of that in these PowerPoint slides when I release them to you, or to you directly, Anna, and you can forward them on. And here, this presentation is branded with a company that is a consortium that I'm helping manage, which is a professional services consortium called RAKER.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no volunteering opportunities there, but we're open to consider new members who want to be involved in that consortium if they have something to offer. So specialists in cybersecurity or risk management or export controls. We're always open to consider people who might want to do some, subcontracting work or consulting work through them, through us. So, and those details are on this slide. But I have a question: are the slides visible now, or not yet?
Yes.
They
They are
are.
very visible.
Okay, so if I
All
do
is good.
this, it's changed.
Yes, we can see the
Okay,
QR code. Brilliant.
great. Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
Yep. Well, great point. We can add at the end that how people can get involved and learn more about this. I'm personally really excited about bringing more law and compliance and optimizing all of these systems inside the legacy systems within space and aerospace. So I definitely think this is really important, and the possibility of even collaborating with you for our members and board members is very interesting. So I'm going to retreat now, let you do your presentation, and thanks so much. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody who's watching live or on the recording for the patience with these issues. So I hope that I can compensate for taking your time with some nice information and some historical case studies and whatnot. So I actually am coming at this both from a training perspective as well. And so I can't see you if you want to enter any questions in the chat for those who are watching live. I won't be able to see them. So at the end of the session, I'll try and finish in about 20 minutes and we can go through any questions if there are there. But I'm very interested to hear comments from you undertaking this course and your experiences and observations so far in your professional career to either complement what I'm saying or give counter examples to what I'm saying. Because we're going to be talking, I broadened this out from specifically to regulation, to politics in general, so including policy as well, so national strategy. And this is somewhat this complements a masterclass I delivered for this program earlier in the year, which was more about space law, both on the international level and the domestic level, and it looked at some problems that can arise for research firms and for businesses when regulation is poorly drafted or poorly implemented, and the same when policy is ill considered as well. And so I encourage you to go back and look at that if you want to look at those particular issues. What we'll talk about today is more about the case studies that I'll refer to are space related because that's predominantly where I'm working in. Although the lessons are able to be universally applied to essentially any area where there's a lot of technology innovation happening and a lot of risk activities. So I hope that even if you're considering an area that's not particularly space related, the lessons will be transferable. And again, I appreciate that you may be coming from different backgrounds, but I am confident that what we're going to go through today will be relevant for you, if at the very least, just to be aware of, because the greater that you can have an appreciation for the regulatory risks involved in your project. Even if you need to bring in an external expert or hire someone or task someone to dealing with them, as a manager or as a professional, just being involved, aware of them, just gives you an advantage from a lot of that'll be out there otherwise in the market. So this is my last masterclass with you, which I already summarized. And today, although we'll be short on time now, the slides will be released to you and I'll be available if any email inquiries or through Diana. But I just want to emphasize a bit how regulation, although regulation can be implemented for the public good, let's say, for legitimate purposes, it's not very often that exclusively it achieves those public good purposes. And there can be a lot of adverse consequences on firms or research centers that are trying to endeavor upon innovation. So not to repeat what I spoke about last time, but just to give some more examples with it from a different approach on how they affect firms doing innovation. And then maybe for the last 10 minutes, we'll speak more about a broader level about how politics can affect innovation in a wider setting, rather than affecting specific firms. And so when we're referring to politics, I'm not using it in a common contemporary sense where politics means trying to gain influence or power within a specific organization, or sometimes it means trying to manipulate a certain circumstance in a particular way. That is one very valid meaning of politics, but the context in which I'm using it today is exclusively about political decision making. So essentially decisions and actions that are done by governments or by delegations of governments. And the reason that distinction is made is because that helps us understand how decisions are made in areas that affect innovation from governments compared to how markets and market actors might make decisions outside of government influence. And so the main ways that politics takes effect in our societies is obviously by institutions such as states and governance processes, which we're not going to speak about today, but essentially we're all nationals of at least one country. And so we have particular, and we're all living in at least one country, at least for the time being while we're on Earth. And so that means that we're all subject to certain rules under that institution that is the state or that particular state and their governance mechanisms. Policy here in the middle is going one level lower and looking at the strategic decisions that are made by that state or its agents, which can range from national security to industry incentives, which is relevant for us today about innovation. Projects like public-private partnerships, how it deals with its foreign affairs, that's policy. And that has very significant effects on innovation. And then regulation, again, another layer beneath policy, let's say, or at least ideally beneath policy, is more specific controlling certain activities of what you can and cannot do. So it's more directly affecting innovation, whereas policy is, let's say, more indirectly affecting innovation. And regulation is, as I would suspect we're all aware, is about obtaining an approval from your state or your government authority in order to do something that's innovative in nature. It need not be innovative, but of course that's the subject matter for today. And just important to know here that it's not only the firms that are doing innovative activities that are affected by politics, it's also the customers of those firms, stakeholders of those firms, so the indirect effects, the investors in those firms and research organizations. There are special interest groups, environmental, animal welfare, depending on what your innovation, what the side effects are of your innovation. Of course, foreign governments and politicians themselves are all affected. So it's important to keep this in mind to not see ourselves in an isolated environment when we're working through a political issue. We're going to first start with regulation because this is the easiest way to find examples where innovative endeavors are affected. All right, so to help us begin our journey here, the main difference between innovation and between regulation and policy in the context of innovation or otherwise is that regulation, first and foremost, is a prohibitive uh, element. So its purpose is to control certain action, but the way that it achieves that is by prohibiting that action. And what I mean by this is that if there's no regulatory framework in the country where you're trying to endeavor in an entrepreneurial activity, there's really no legal reason why you can't do that activity. So what governments do is they set up a statutory instrument or a legislative document that establishes a prohibition for doing a certain activity, whether it's launching a rocket, designing a new UAV system, self-driving car, some explosives, whatever that might be. And they say, okay, and if you read the first few pages of any regulatory document, you'll see that it's very clearly written that the penalty for doing this activity is this many months in jail or this many thousands of dollars in fines. So that's what's establishing the prohibition. Only after that are there ways that one can be exempted from those penalties. And that's what we refer to as licenses or permits or certifications. But it's very important to appreciate regulation for what it is, which is a prohibitive framework. So when you hear governments say that they're facilitating industry by regulating it, that's true to an extent where regulating an industry gives the industry actors, the customers of those actors, and the investors of those actors some confidence about the parameters in which they're working in. But in reality, having no regulation means that you have a blank slate playing field to test and try new ideas. It's just very difficult to gain investment for that because there's nothing then preventing the government from coming in and stopping it, which is seen quite often in space activities where governments are amending their regulation to adapt to new innovations that don't fit into the existing regulatory frameworks. Policy is much softer, let's say. It's guiding action rather than controlling it, and also trying to facilitate decision-making on a statewide level sometimes, or at least on a localized governance level. And it's aiming for some cohesion amongst the different agents of government in what they're trying to achieve and trying to encourage society to come along with that idea. So why would we regulate innovation at all? I hope that you would at least be able to come up with one idea, one reason why. To me, there are three main reasons why. One of them is more particular for aerospace regulation, although equally relevant, let's say, for artificial intelligence regulation or for data protection regulations, and it will be increasingly so, is countries need to comply with international obligations. So through international treaties that states as an institute sign with other countries. Sometimes it can be through the United Nations hosting these multilateral treaties, or sometimes it's a bilateral treaty with one country's government signing an agreement with another country's government. But more and more is the case in these, let's say, more uncertain or high risk related areas. There's more active obligations on countries to comply with these treaties rather than passive requirements. So instead of a country just making sure it's not breaching the international agreement, in aerospace, it tends to be the case that there's actually pressure to develop regulation or have a national policy in order to actively comply with an international obligation. And it's certainly the case with space activity and aviation, is that when a country decides to regulate a new area of aviation or space, it better be looking at that in those international obligations and weaving the relevant requirements into its framework in order to not inadvertently be at breach. Another main reason, of course, is national security or geopolitical motivations, soft power and warfare power. So the state's interests on a strategic level. And then, of course, on a more, let's say, citizen tier, is public safety and ensuring that there's no damage or destruction to property. And this is not only to third parties, it's also the states regulate innovative activities in order to try and protect the people who are involved in doing those activities. For instance, with a rocket launch, the regulation is also making sure, at least trying to make sure, that the people who are loading the explosives in the launch vehicle are also protected. One consequence of regulation that I spoke about in our February session was regulatory capture. So just because these motivations here are well-intentioned, it doesn't mean that the outcome of implementing or following the regulation has positive effects. One negative effect is what's called regulatory capture. So I encourage you to go back, if it's available, to look at the content from the February masterclass, or at least the learning outcomes from that, to understand the significance of regulatory capture, why it's so important for both big firms and small firms, and how it's so prevalent in industries such as aerospace. But for the benefit of those who weren't at that session, it's worth emphasizing it, because it is such an important point, which has been validated by companies that are in fact benefiting from regulatory capture. So here is the CEO of Goldman Sachs. Until 2018, he was the CEO, and he conceded as much, that regulatory capture essentially is like one football team controlling the rules of the entire league to that one team's benefit. And Goldman Sachs concedes that it does this by saying that because of all the innovation happening in industry right now, there's a lot of new ventures that are coming that could compete with even financial institutions, let alone technology-related institutions. But because the area of finance in this case is so heavily regulated, that actually works as a benefit for more established firms like Goldman Sachs, because it sets up a barrier for new entrants to come in, because the regulations are so complicated, because it's very, very hard to build relationships up with the bureaucrats who are affecting that regulation. And these large firms have built those relationships up already. And in many cases are often very influential in what the law looks like that controls that. So I added this in there because it wasn't in the last presentation. But this is just to give evidence to my claim that regulatory capture is a real thing. And it's something that, whether you're in a small company trying to break into a market, or if you're in an existing company that has competitors in the market, it's something that you need to be aware of, because it's really what facilitates monopolies in the corporate world, is regulatory capture. So that's one adverse consequence of regulation, despite the public safety motivations it might have. Then there are other types of consequences, which are called unintended consequences of regulation. I'm going to run through this a bit quickly here, unfortunately, because of the trouble that I had connecting at the beginning. But with regulation, you have other challenges besides the creation of monopolies in innovation and technology. Here's an example in Australia's regulatory requirements to get a license to launch a rocket. One of the conditions is that when you receive your license, the government sends out a launch safety officer who has to ensure that you're not putting the public in any danger, and to make sure that you're complying with the conditions of your license. So your license will have a bunch of conditions that you need to do, and this launch safety officer is sent by the government to make sure that you're complying with them. Now, in my opinion, these two functions seem completely reasonable. It's good to have a third party on site to make sure that to have another set of, independent eyes, making sure that the parties who have a commercial interest in the launch aren't missing anything, and to make sure that just there's another set of eyes to make sure you're complying with everything. However, in reality, it's much more nuanced than that, because how those functions are given effect is through giving the launch safety officer such broad powers. We don't even need to read all of this second subsection here. We can just stick to the first sentence, where it says that the launch safety officer may do all things that are reasonably necessary or convenient to perform the functions. So to perform public safety and the compliance with the launch permit, the launch safety officer can do everything that's reasonably necessary or convenient. One of the problems with this is that there's no definition of what's reasonably necessary or what's convenient. There's no test or threshold that the launch actors or the operators of the spaceport have to be able to balance out whether what the launch safety officer is asking is reasonable. And the reason this is all relevant is because the launch safety officer, while they might be very enthusiastic about facilitating a launch activity, they are appointed and paid by the government. And they're the ones who the government points to if something is going to go wrong. So they have an incentive to try and limit the amount of risk that's happening. And for innovation in technology, risk is something inherent in what you're doing. Controlling the risk, of course, is a different issue, but accepting that there is going to be risk that will need to be controlled is something that, not just with aerospace activities, with a range of advanced technological, and all these wonderful things that computers and software can do for us now, risk is something that we have to face. And Australia is a little bit like the governments of European countries, where it's incredibly risk averse in terms of technological innovations. This is one advantage that doing such activities in the United States has compared to Australia or many European states, is because there's a greater appetite for risk. So in Australia, you have already a risk-averse culture in the government, and the launch safety officer is part of that apparatus by being contracted by the government. So when push comes to shove, as we say, when there's a choice between the launch safety officer is not sure if this might be a risk to safety or not, they're going to err on the side of caution and either ask to re-inspect the vehicle or ask for a new procedure or ask for evidence that it is safe. And that causes delays. It could cause a delay by several days, depending on what it is, or it could cause a scrap of a launch. So it's not conducive to innovation the way that this is drafted. So this is a commercial consequence that has adverse consequences. So much so that in Australia, it's happening because launch companies who are considering going to Australia, they experience the complications with this, with one such provision. This is one provision in the entire statute that I've taken as an example. And they say, oh, hold on, but if we go to this other place, we don't have these risks of, someone coming in and just being able to control everything at will, which is a risk that the launch providers need to take into account. So besides commercial risk, there's also a safety risk, because basically the duties of the launch safety officer really only begin 20 days before launch, because that's when the notice periods begin that they're responsible. They have to give notice to different stakeholders, and they have to do that 20 days before a launch, which means that there's nothing else that they're contracted to do inside the regulation before those 20 days. So think about it. If you're designing a launch mission, even if it's a new space launch mission, you may be having meetings every couple of weeks, 18 months in advance, with not just the spaceport operator and the launch provider, but also with different stakeholders. So the airline, the airspace users, so the airlines, and the homesteads who live in and around the flight path, and the environmental groups all come to these meetings where they can express their concerns with safety. And then the launch provider and the spaceport operator come together and try and address those concerns. And so you've had an iterative process in safety, and then you've got someone coming in who's responsible for safety only a few weeks before the launch, you have to brief them, and there is a risk that they could do something unsafe on the launch site, because you may not have been able to brief them comprehensively enough in those 20 days. Or what else is a risk is you have, they can bring delegates on site as well. So they could have 2 or 3 people. So you have, 3 or 4 people on site who aren't involved in the mission, who haven't been briefed and involved in those processes. This is a real safety concern for the launch vehicle operators and for the spaceport operators. And it's completely understandable why these things weren't considered in the drafting of the legislation, because legislation is drafted not by experts, it's drafted by people who are professionals at drafting legislation. So these things only come when industry makes government aware that these are the concerns. So it's possible that the government can contract beyond 20 days because they're aware of that. But the regulation itself doesn't make it a requirement, which means that it's a risk because the government may decide not to do that. So the point I wanted to make here, emphasizing with regulation, is that there are always costs with regulation, complying with regulation, and there are almost always unintended consequences. One of the very few exceptions where there aren't a lot of documented unintended consequences is something like labeling hazardous goods. That's very low cost for industry actors to comply with that in most cases. And it's very, you have to really stretch your mind in order to be able to speculate on an unintended consequences with this. Although I'm sure there have been, there have been somehow. But so here, when we talk about regulation, let's say a quote unquote good regulation does two things. It solves a problem in society. So this doesn't mean speculating that there might be a problem with, artificial intelligence could cause this problem, or, we might have an issue with, data breaches over here. No, you have to actually plausibly demonstrate why there's either the risk of the problem or demonstrate that the problem, is in proximity. And then the regulation, if regulation is necessary, there may be other ways to deal with the problem other than regulation. But if regulation is the appropriate way to solve that problem, then it should do so without creating new problems, or at the very least have a monitoring mechanism in place, such as through regular industry consultations, or a bureaucrat who's in charge of overseeing, the effect on industry, and have a monitoring mechanism in there to always weigh up what the costs and consequences are compared to the benefit. Are we enacting public safety to a degree that's great enough to warrant, excluding all these new market actors from doing the activity? So having essentially a cost-benefit analysis, which is quite rare that comprehensive cost-benefit analyses are done in most European countries and in Australia for sure. This is a great book. Unfortunately, the QR code won't lead you to a free copy. But if you Google the title, you'll find a free copy, a free PDF. And it really is an excellent book going through case study by case study on unintended consequences of government regulation and policy. But not just in technology and innovation, in a range of areas. But the principles are very useful because they're transferable to areas of innovation. So I highly encourage you to, and it only takes a few hours to read the book, and there are discrete chapters as well. So it's a very good examples of case studies where, and quite often it's the smaller companies or even vulnerable members of society, such as ethnic minorities or people with low incomes, who are the ones who are damaged by many good-intentioned regulations or policies. So the point here is just to be aware that the unintended consequences exist. It may not be that you need to always do everything unregulated, but you need to not be, the government needs to not be dismissive of unintended consequences. And as a market actor, you need to be prepared for unintended consequences. So we're almost running out of time here. So what I'm going to do to allow for questions if there's any, because I understand, I guess there's only 5 minutes by my time here, is I'll just work out what the most efficient way to go through this is. In the previous masterclass I gave, I spoke about effects on market actors because of policy. Here I had intended to speak more about a macro perspective on what policy, as in what political government policy has with innovation, the effects it has on innovation. So the main point here was using research and development as a means to, because innovation is very hard to quantify. We can't put metrics on innovation, really. We can see how good it has helped society, but it's very hard to measure in a consistent way. So research and development is one way that we can consistently measure innovation, because successful research and development leads to innovation. And with research and development, we have a clear, at least an accounting record of the costs involved. However, not everything is about accounting. Not everything is about finances. There are other costs that come through making efforts in research and innovation, in research and development towards innovation. But those costs look very different when they're undertaken from market actors in the absence of government subsidies or government contracts, so in isolated endeavors, compared to what the political costs look like when governments finance because we're obliged to pay taxes or something like that. And I've put some examples in here of purely market financed wonderful achievements that drove innovations and drove the development of space. Again, space is my area, but I would be very confident that similar patterns can be found in other technological areas of innovation. And even I really like this story, but because of time, I won't go into it. Even Sputnik, although that was financed through politics because it was financed by states using the public resources to do this, the concept of an artificial satellite came from apolitical motivations. It was because of science and research endeavors that an artificial satellite was even conceived of as a way to try and measure, have sustained flight in the upper atmosphere to take reliable measurements of the upper atmosphere. And so a satellite, of course, was the concept thought about putting something into orbit rather than just using a sounding rocket. So this is where we kind of have a transition in space from market financed space achievements to political space, exclusively political space, right up until, let's say, the 1980s, when private endeavors started contracting with government agencies and collaborating with them, and then, of course, new space in the 2000s, where we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence in market finance. The last thing I want to mention here, in the time I have with you, is that the costs in innovation from market innovation are very different to the costs from political innovations. Market financing research and development through the market means that people voluntarily give their resources to an entrepreneur to try and do something, whether that's through an uncle or a family member giving money to their nephew or their niece in order to endeavor upon something as a way of support, or a venture capitalist or an investment firm agreeing that, okay, this is a good idea, so I'm giving you my money. There are no costs in that means of financing on society. There may be costs on society with how that financing is used. For instance, if you're developing something that can be used as a weapon, or there's a side effect, that you've released a biological hazard or something, then that has effects on society. But the means of financing it doesn't impose any costs on society. Financing through politics, so through state-commissioned research and development, always has costs on society, whether it's through taxation, which limits the way that people and companies can use their resources, inflation, and we're talking about the technical meaning of inflation here, not the contemporary usage of inflation. Inflation technically means an increase in the supply of money. And so an increase in prices is one effect of increasing the supply of money, but it is not the only effect, and in and of itself is not what economists refer to as inflation. It's what governments have used to try and, or have conveniently used to shift the meaning away. So now we have price inflation, which is essentially the rise in prices, and then monetary inflation, which is the historical definition of inflation, which essentially means diluting the money supply, or the effect is to dilute the money supply, which then means that the money that you or I have is worth less because you need more of it in order to purchase the same quantity of goods or services. And the third way is basically what we call kicking the can down the road and subjecting society to a future obligation to make good by inflation or tax. That's by the government engaging in public debt. Because no matter what revenue streams a government can produce with what it's investing in, those revenue streams come nowhere close to the actual amount of public debt that a government has. So if a government is going to make good on its public debt in full, it needs to rely on either tax or inflation or both. So if I can leave you with that lesson as the last today, is that financing through politics has implications on innovation, even with all the wonderful things that states do in aerospace, in which we have some examples here. So not only with exploration, putting humans in space and on the moon, but also, spearheading the telecommunications revolution, Landsat having Earth observation data. These all were not without costs on society. And although they brought benefits to society, we will never know what the costs were. And one kind of final example here is on the right, we have the space shuttle. And there is quite well documented evidence of how the space shuttle program was really discouraging the private actors at the time in the United States who were considering and going for investment in space travel and human space flight, who just decided, well, there's no point doing it now because the state has monopolized this. So better let the state do it. I'm not going to get investment. And so the space shuttle is one example of how, right, we had benefits from the space shuttle, but we know that that wasn't a sustainable program, and we know the problems that had with the fatalities from it, which of course can happen in a private model, but the incentive structures are very different. And so there's always costs with political financing on innovation that are very different to market financing. But because of the element of new space now, we may be able to see more innovation, a greater proportion of innovation coming from market-driven incentives rather than through state centralized space activities. And the same might be the same with artificial intelligence or, unmanned aerial vehicles or whatever wonderful technologies you'll be endeavoring on in your career. So here are some resources. I'm very appreciative of your time. I apologize that I've gone over time, but I thank you for entertaining the issues we had at the beginning. And Diana, if you want to open it up to questions, or if you have any questions from yourself, I'm happy to stay on for a few more minutes.
Hello, yeah, thank you so much for the talk. Very, very interesting stuff. And the more we listen, the more we realize we're barely scratching the surface. There's so much exciting stuff happening there. So just to wrap up with your last point, that new space research has been deep tech for a long time, starting with the Sputnik satellite, and now we're going into new legal and ethical questions, for example, around Starlink, around, reusable rockets and boosters being caught. It seems like the new space industry is growing, and it raises questions on, how is this going to look like? How is this mix going to change over time of politically driven innovation in space versus commercially driven? And, it makes you wonder also in the financial part, what drives it, right? It must be some form of gain. Of course, it's the curiosity to just go into space, and conquer new space. That's kind of like the whole point of the academy. But then there are possibilities like, asteroid mining, which would be a new industry in itself that we might even have trouble conceptualizing, as well as whatever it is that we find on other planets. I mean, if I think of an analogy, it's probably Columbus going to see the new world, right? What happened there is something that we couldn't really conceive before it actually happened. That's the whole point of being an explorer. So one thing that we're thinking about in the academy is to have exams or quizzes that make people think from that perspective of a duty to the future. I don't know if you're a Star Trek fan or thinking in those terms, but these sort of use cases would be extremely useful. So if you have any use cases that you'd like to wrap up with, that you would like 19, 20-year-old aerospace engineering students to think about, what is interesting for us to think about right now, and how should we act on it in a way that is new, related to, for example, Starlink, the ethics around it, the legals around it, reusable rockets, asteroid mining, anything that crosses your mind at this point, climate change, research, terraforming, all of these issues, right? That how should we think about it? What is a new way to think about this? Should we be more entrepreneurial about one thing or another? How do we design policy that, as you very well put it, solves problems rather than create new ones, or at least solves more problems than it creates. Yeah, I'd like to wrap up with this.
Yeah, that's a really a collection of very wonderful topics that you've gone over there. With regards to space mining in general, so actually there'll be a compendium published in the coming months, which is a collection of chapters specifically about the law and space mining and space resources utilization, including mining. And there are some wonderful articles and books on that topic already. But the technology is more or less is feasible. It's the financial case that is why there's a bit of hesitation in doing these ventures. But the plausibility is certainly made out there. And there are wonderful questions about, from my particular interest in this field is how will property rights be managed for these endeavors, because there are principles in the international legal frameworks which have quite a lot of influence on this, but there's a lot of examples both from governments and from academics about how these can be interpreted or applied in a way that is conducive to innovation and peace, right, and sustainability, rather than having to rely on regulation being responsible. Because, as I hope I made clear, regulation may have an intention to be environmentally sustainable or to protect, equality among diverse people, but it doesn't mean it has all the information to be effective in doing that, and it can have very bad consequences if it's not doing it effectively. So there is a role also for the entrepreneurs to work this out themselves with their own risk, because if they make a mistake, they also lose their investment and their reputation. So there are incentives in there to do that. And asteroid and space resources is one way, not just with property rights, but also with intellectual property as well. There are also there's a lot of room to develop, or let's say, step back from intellectual property and to see, having maybe more open information access platforms to see whether that is beneficial for everyday people and consumers, or whether we want to monopolize certain ideas like we do on Earth. So these are wonderful questions that space can offer us, and likely the digital realm as well can offer us, what it means to have, certain applications or processes that are done through digital providers or platforms, what IP means in that sense as well. To your question about the role of the future, or responsibility towards the future, again, I maybe have a overly optimistic viewpoint that there are a lot of ways that when entrepreneurs are left to innovate on their own, a lot of these solutions can be resolved. The problem is when those entrepreneurs get special favors or they get incentivized by governments to do things a certain way, whether they get protection or they get a special license that their competitors don't get. This then incentivizes them to become part of the political apparatus and moves them away from being a purely market actor, where their incentive is to provide solutions for customers and stakeholders. So keeping that barrier in your eyesight is really important to know when this entrepreneur is actually doing entrepreneurial activity, or they're more interacting with the state and an agent for the state. But if they're purely entrepreneurial, there's a lot of incentives there that by doing good business are easily compatible to have environmental sustainability, to make sure that we're not depleting resources and aspects like that. And because I work in that industry, it may be easier for me to see them, and because I'm working on the other side of the government, it's easier for me to see the adverse consequences of the government. But I would say that the government's responsibility in future generations is not to keep on putting future generations in a debt that they're not going to be able to repay. So the example I gave of our children and their grandchildren, if countries keep on going into public debt, the only way to make good on those debts is by printing more money and devaluing our resources, or by taking our resources through taxation. So that's a responsibility that states can have to future generations, rather than focusing only on sustainable or equity kind of goals.
Very interesting points. And again, definitely worth going deeper into this, the connection between financing, R&D, and what happens commercially. There are so many questions. And the thing is, we also have historical events that we can look at and perhaps extrapolate for the future. For example, Hiroshima, a great example of, fantastic R&D that was funded in a certain way and then was also used in a certain way, right? And then we look at Starlink and we see what the idea behind it is. Very often it happens that companies have this wonderful idea. For example, Meta wanted to connect people more, right? But then there are also fragmented consequences that happen. And it's, I guess, the job of people in law, in regulatory, to understand these interdependencies between finance, between science, governments, and all that. So I'm really happy to have people like you on board to get to think about these things, and maybe to have people that can come up with solutions and ideas that maybe didn't cross our mind yet. At the top of my head, I can definitely see, well, maybe I'm too much of a Star Trek fan, but I definitely see a point for a galactic federation, like to have, at least a global perspective, a bit like the UN, on how this is going to go, right? If someone puts the flag on a new planet, does it matter if this is a particular country? What happens if other countries do as well, right? Do we end up a situation where we have colonies, a bit like we had with the US? So many fascinating questions. And yeah, I'm happy to wrap up with this, but I'm also happy to continue this, and also, look deeper into building more partnerships, into better understanding what network are we creating, what is the end goal, what kind of people we need in there, and how to train them. That's what we're about.
Yeah, I mean, apart from doing questions, as I think was one of your suggestions, perhaps also interactive workshops is a really good way to share knowledge between people. And it's what I do in trainings, by examining. So some of the examples I had here, I actually have as training content to encourage participants or graduate students to actually analyze the legal provision and think about the unintended consequences, or think about how it could be reformed or drafted in a more conducive way to public safety or entrepreneurship or something like that. And then you have more of an exchange of ideas when people are interacting with each other, which can be done. It doesn't have to be done on a video either. It can also be done just with a crude example is having a Google sheet or something like that, where people just contribute their ideas. But something like that, I think, can also be a good way to reach solutions and be introduced to new ideas.
I would love to do that, Scott. Let's put a pin in that, and let's think about, potentially organizing some kind of a hackathon. I would love to have people involved on both sides, a bit like, right, like how members of the board are also from different governments, from industry primes, from OEMs, from startups, and then having students in there as well. I think this can be very interesting. We're just going to give it a think about how to organize it. But this definitely like sparked a lot of ideas. There's so many ramifications here.
Yeah, great. Happy to be in touch and hear ideas and contribute. So yeah, thanks for humoring me in my passions.
Thank you so much, Scott. This has been fantastic. Have a great day and talk soon.
Yeah, goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.